This is Sue Dibble from Oakmont, although it looks like I'm in Hawaii. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Sally Roche Wagner from New York talking to us today about uh, fact-checking feminism. And she's interesting. She was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for her work in women's studies. Currently, she's taught women's studies courses for over 50 years, and she serves as a faculty member in Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. She's written prolifically, a lot of books, which I'm hoping she'll share with you today. Currently, she's the founder and executive director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Center for Social Justice Dialogue in Fayetteville, New York. And she has decided that she's going to be able to speak to us today, and I am so happy. So without further ado, because I could talk for a very long time, just doing the introduction, and then you wouldn't hear her. Without further ado, Dr. Wagner, would you like to chime in now?
I will, Sue. Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you today. I do want to fact check feminism with you. And I think if we start with what is the dominant narrative? What do we know about the women's suffrage movement? What have we learned in school, if we learned anything? And what's the kind of general knowledge? Well, it begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, and it's a fight for the vote only that goes to 1920 when the 19th Amendment is finally ratified and becomes part of the Constitution, and women are given the right to vote. And it's Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who lead the parade. And it's pretty much a parade of two. Every piece of that is wrong. So where do we begin? Well, we don't begin when white people come to this land. I think we settler colonialists tend to prioritize ourselves, and in our arrogance think that, well, the party really begins when we get here. Well, the reality is that there is a party going on long before we get here, and it's actually a much better party than the one that we brought and continue to practice. I am on Onondaga Aboriginal land. I'm in Syracuse, New York. This is the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations. Yeah, I don't know if you ever learned about the Six Nations in California. I didn't in South Dakota, but you may recognize some of the names. The Confederacy was initially made up of the Mohawks, the Keepers of the Eastern Door, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the center of the Confederacy, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and then the Tuscarora joined in the 1700s. And this Confederacy was based on peace. It was based on equality. It was based on harmony. And women in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy have had political voice for 1,000 years on the land where I live right now. 1,000 years, while we in 2020 are celebrating 100 years of having our political voice partially guaranteed. I just finished a book for young people, We Want Equal Rights. And the subtitle of it, I'm gonna have to read it because it's so new I don't remember. How Suffragists Were Influenced by Haudenosaunee Women. Let me tell you some of the ways, and that book is based on my older Sisters in Spirit, Haudenosaunee influence on early feminists, early American feminists. And the influence is this. Before women began to organize in the 1830s, not the 1840s, but the 1830s, after the revolution, women became dead in the law. Now, before the revolution, women served as lawyers, as doctors, as and they had political voice if they had enough property. Voting rights were based on property. And if you had enough property, you could vote. And women did sometimes in the colonies. Then the revolution happens, and women are pushed down in terms of their rights. First of all, the constitutions that are written and the laws that are written begin to say you have to go through an educational process to practice law, to become a doctor, any of the professions, and women were excluded from education in those institutions. So women couldn't practice the things they had practiced professionally before the revolution. The other thing is that the states, one by one, passed laws making it illegal for women to vote. They also adopted the Blackstone Code. Now, this was a repressive common law code that England had just adopted. And you may know Abigail Adams' quote, John, this particular care and attention is paid to the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion. She was really specifically talking about don't adopt the Blackstone Code. Well, the founding fathers went ahead and did it. And what it meant was literally dead in the law. You ceased to exist legally once you married. It wasn't a matter of rights. It was several steps above that. You didn't have personhood. So of course you had no political voice. The two shall become one, and the one is the man. That was canon law, and common law was based on that. And so it really follows the biblical sanction or of the punishment of Eve, that woman is to be under the authority of man because of the sin of Eve. And that goes all the way to St. Paul. Woman is to be obedient to her husband. So that means you can't serve on juries, you can't sue and be sued, you can't exercise any of the rights of a political entity. It also means you have no right to your children. Husbands could will away unborn children, and on their deathbed, write a will saying, my wife is pregnant. When she gives birth to this child, it's to be given to this other person as their property, their guardianship. And that child is ripped from its mother's arms and given to its rightful owner. And the mother has no say in it because she has no legal entity. And she had no right to her body. Husbands could beat their wives into submission as long as they did not inflict permanent damage. And husbands could rape their wives. That was legally sanctioned. The rape laws read usually something like an act of unlawful sexual intercourse by someone other than the wife, or on someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. I remember in 1980, the first marital rape law came into the California state legislature. And on the floor of the Senate, a senator said, oh, come on, guys. If you can't rape your wife, who can you rape? And the Senate erupted in laughter. Those laws, the marital rape laws, were not changed until the second wave of feminism in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. So what else? Oh, you had no right to your property. Once you married, everything that any possession you had coming into the marriage, or any possession that you brought into the marriage, became property of your husband. And he could do anything he wanted to with it. So here are these women who live in this condition, and they know women who live in a world that is totally different. Let me give you a couple of examples. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who is an unknown suffragist, she actually got written out of history, and part of the reason is the story I'm telling you, because she's the one who really carries the story of the Haudenosaunee influence on the women's rights movement. So does Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but it's primarily Gage. Matilda Jocelyn Gage writes in her major work, Woman, Church, and State, never was justice more perfect. Never was civilization higher. And she's referring to indigenous nations. She's referring specifically to the Haudenosaunee. And she writes about how the Haudenosaunee women have the final decision in any decisions about peace and war, about land, how they have their own property, how they are the agriculturalists and really are, if you think about it, they control the economy. They raise corn, beans, and squash, nutritionally perfect, and ecologically perfect as well. Nutritionally perfect because if you eat nothing but these three things in combination, prepared properly, you don't actually need to eat anything else. It's a perfect food group. It also ecologically is perfect because the beans set the nitrates in the soil for the corn. The corn, it provides the stalk for the beans to twine around. The squash covers the mound, keeping the critters and the birds out and creating a kind of a microcosm soil so that the corn, which has very close roots to the surface, is kept constantly moisturized. It's perfect. They call the three sisters, the Haudenosaunee call them, the three supporters, the three sustainers. So the women created, the idea was that women were most sacred, so they would bring forth life from the soil, from Mother Earth. The earth and woman being the most sacred because they are the creators of life and the sustainers of life. So it's not just rights, you see. What they see is a transformed society. They see the end of patriarchy, basically, is what Matilda Jocelyn Gage sees. And what she says in the final words of her book, Woman, Church, and State, little commercial here. You can either look for it online, it's searchable and it's free to download, or if you want your own copy, you can purchase it through the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation website, matildajocelyngage.org. But her final words in that book are, we're in the middle of a revolution. We see the results of it. The end of it will be a transformed world. It will result in the destruction, the end of every existing institution, and the result will be a regenerated world. Now, that's a vision of the end of patriarchy. How could she see that? Well, she saw that world in action with the Haudenosaunee. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a couple of things. She writes about, well, backing up to describe to you what they understood. The clan mothers are equal with the chiefs. It's a balance of authority. But the clan mothers hold the position of the chief of their clan, the sachem, the one who will make the decisions for the clan in Grand Council. She holds that position. She is the only one who can nominate, choose, remove the chief. Conditions: he cannot have committed a murder and have served. If he did, he has to step down as a warrior. He can't have committed a theft. He can't have stolen anything, and he can't have abused a woman or a child. I will tell you honestly that my clan mother friends ask me, why is that man in the White House? Why have you not removed him? We would remove him in a minute. He would never have even made it to that position. As they're raising these boys, the clan mother is looking for, because they're living close to their grandkids. It's an extended family. It's a clan. It is the clan is made up in the longhouse, the traditional way of living. It was the clan mother and the father, the sisters, their children, their husbands, and the unmarried sons. When the sons married, they would go off and live with their wives. And that still happens. They go to live in the wife's community because that's the clan that the children are part of. Children are born into their mother's clan, not a patrilineal line, not a patriarchy. It is a matrilineal line. I remember trying to explain to a friend of mine, an Onondaga a friend of mine, the concept of illegitimacy. And she just couldn't, there was no way she couldn't compute. How can a child be illegal? You always know who your mother is. So the difference culturally, even today, is astounding to me. But then, if you can imagine these women who are living under the oppressive conditions I just described, being in contact with and knowing Haudenosaunee women. Let me take you to three places, okay? First of all, let's go to the International Council of Women in 1888. Washington, D.C., it's the first time that women are gathering on United States soil internationally from the Western countries to discuss and look at their position as women. A woman named Alice Fletcher is one of the speakers. She's an early ethnographer and anthropologist, and she tells this story. She's with a group of women from the Omaha Nation, one of the Plains nations, and she says, well, one of the women, it was her host, the woman she was staying with, gives away a horse. And Alice says, oh, hadn't you better check with your husband? She said, without thinking, I said that. And the merriment with which my statement was met. Here are these Native women, these indigenous women that are just laughing their heads off at this white woman. Why would you check with your husband? She said, I forgot for a minute that I was with Indian women. And then she goes on to give a couple more stories and examples. And she says, you know, I have talked repeatedly to Indian women, and I have always been told, we are so afraid of what's going to happen to us when we come under United States law. As an Indian woman, I was free. If I come under United States law, I'm going to be treated as badly as white women are. Indian men knew this as well. Sitting Bull is one of the examples of one of the Lakota men who told her the same thing. We're worried about what's going to happen to us when we come under United States law as men, but we're more worried about the women because they're going to lose their rights as women and they're going to lose their rights as Indians. It's a double loss. Let me take you next to the National Council of Women, 1891. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is addressing the council, and her speech is the matriarchate. And she's talking about indigenous nation after indigenous nation, where the women have far superior rights and responsibilities than do the women of the United States or any of the states within the United States. That's her model. And a couple of stories, a couple of examples she gives. One is that she has taken a stance early on that women should be able to get a divorce if they're in a dangerous marriage, if their lives are in danger, or if they're in a loveless marriage, they should be able to get out. She is called a heretic for taking that position because at the time, the dominant Christian belief was that marriage was not a civil arrangement between two people. It was a covenant with God, and you don't break a covenant with God. She talks about divorce Haudenosaunee style in this 1891 speech. And she says, if he misbehaves himself, he will find his belongings outside the longhouse in a minute. And that's it. That's the end of the marriage. A woman will just simply remove him. Still goes on today. She also talks about the clan mother having the right of removing the chief. And she says, she will cut off his horns. That's one of the expressions that's used. She places the symbol of his authority that she carries. She places that, it's a deer, antlers. She places that on his head when she installs him. in the condolence ceremony and raises him up as a chief. And she alone has the responsibility, the right to remove that. Stanton calls it cutting off the horns. Well, I remember at an Elizabeth Cady Stanton birthday 2 years ago, I spoke with one of the clan mothers, and I used Stanton's quote, cut off his horns, has the right to cut off his horns. You know, and the crowd of feminists went nuts, of course. Audrey, the clan mother, got up and said, you know, one of my responsibilities is that I hold the chief in his position. He has to listen to me, and, you know, and I counsel him, and then I keep him on the path. If he strays from the path, I warn him. The second time, if he does it again, I warn him again, bring him back to the path, do everything I can to help him know what he should be doing. He has to make decisions for the seventh generation, all his decisions. If he does it a third time, then I have the responsibility to remove him from his position. She said, I've never seen it, never done it. It would be the saddest thing I could ever see, because we would be so out of balance. And when Audrey and I talked, we realized that responsibilities are what you have when you have a culture, a political system that is in balance. Rights are what you want when your system is not in balance, when there's an imbalance of power. So this is what the women saw, and the kicker is this. In 1893, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, in her village of Fayetteville, New York, votes for a school superintendent in a school election. Now, women have gained the right to vote for school board members and in local elections, but not state, and superintendent is a state office. She's pushing the envelope, she's arrested, she doesn't win the case. 1893, the same year, she's given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation and given a real name, Ho'anahaui, that is still used today. She holds the sky. I'm Facebook friends with the woman who carries that name today. She writes to her daughter, my clan sisters are considering me for a voice in the Council of Matrons, which would give me a say in the choosing of the police, or the chief, the choosing of the chief. Arrested in her own community for voting, in her own village, in her own state, in her own nation for voting. She is considered to have the possibility of a political voice in her honorarily adopted nation. That's the beginning of the women's rights movement. Now, there's so much that goes on in between. I'm going to just give you a couple of high points and then take you to the end. And the rest, if you are interested, you will find in the women's suffrage movement. This is my book that came out last year from Penguin Classics. Gloria Steinem, my friend, wrote the introduction. And I not only tell you this entire story, but I give you the documents, the sources that you can read. You should be skeptical, but read the documents that support the story I'm telling. Let's not start with 1848. Let's start with 1832, when the first female anti-slavery movement is begun, an organization by African-American women. By 1837, it is a mixed organization of white and African-American women. It's a national organization. They hold their first convention. And this is where these women learn in their individual communities and organizing nationally. They learn to speak in public. They learn to petition. They learn to hold meetings and conventions. They gain their political voice. They learn how to raise money for the movement, and they learn how to face down mobs. 1838, the convention is happening. The female anti-slavery convention is happening in Philadelphia. There's a crowd that gathers, a mob outside Philadelphia Hall where they're meeting. And the mob gets more and more violent, and they begin to throw rocks through the window. The women, they threaten to set the building on fire, which they actually do later on after, but the women realize they have to leave. But when they leave, every white woman ensures that she is accompanying an African American woman, one or two, to accompany them, knowing that they are most at risk. And so they leave the building and the mob burns it down. They have courage. They are the women that organize the Seneca Falls Convention. All the organizers, four of them they're like seasoned veterans of the female anti-slavery societies. They know what they're doing. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the only one that hasn't been really part of that. So we move to that. Then we come to the 1850s. We're going to gallop through the rest of this because I really wanted to instill in you the sense of these indigenous women who 1,000 years have had political voice in a confederacy of nations, still sovereign today, is Gage supported. She wrote in favor of sovereignty. She wrote in favor of ensuring that the government lives up to the treaties that it has. She wrote about the superior position of Native women. That's why she gets an honorary adoption. She's an ally. But in 1850, when they start meeting, the women meeting regularly in national conventions with their male allies. And of course, men have always been part of the movement. You can't make a movement without allies. Come on. So they raise every issue that we're raising today. They raise the issue of equal pay for equal work. I mean, that's old hat by 1850. Any kind of employment discrimination, they begin to fight. They fight for the right of women to be free from violence. They fight for property rights. They fight for reproductive justice. Stanton and Gage end up making this argument. We believe in the sanctity of the unborn. We believe in the sacred rights of the children. The most sacred right of all is to be wanted and chosen and welcome into the world. And the only way we can ensure that is if women have absolute control of their bodies. That's the early feminists. Now, what happens is after the Civil War, the abolitionists and the women's rights meeting at the same time, they're all, they're interconnected. If you scratch an abolitionist, you find a women's rights advocate. And after the Civil War, they determined, the women of the suffragists during the Civil War say, we're not going to deal with our issues right now. We're going to force Abraham Lincoln to fight this war to end slavery. He's saying at the time the war is being fought to preserve the Union, blah, blah, blah. They say no. They gathered the largest number of signatures ever gathered on the United States soil to that point, with people saying we will only support this war effort as long as it's being fought to end slavery. So after the war, slavery's ended. This is the moment when the abolitionists and the suffragists come together and they say, let's work for universal suffrage. Let's get the vote for everybody right now. And it's the moment to do it. Radical Republicans, yes, it's not an oxymoron. That's what they were called. They were the Progressive Party. They said, first of all, yeah, we should. And then they got cold feet for whatever political reasons. And they said, no, we can only get African-American men vote right now. And so the 14th and 15th Amendment does that. 14th Amendment actually writes women out of citizenship, says male citizens 3 times in the 14th, enabling the amendment that really enables the end of voter suppression, but not sufficiently. So they split. And there's racist statements by Stanton and Anthony at the time that they need to be held accountable for. They were held accountable for them at the time. Their co-workers said, totally unacceptable. So they then formed two different organizations, the National and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Very different, very different. One's much more conservative. The American has male officers. National has only women officers. The National works for a federal amendment. The American works for the vote state by state. Now, think about it. This is a moment when it's sort of up for question. Does the federal government or do the states determine voting, who votes, and the conditions of voting? If you say that states can give women the right to vote, aren't you also saying, well, maybe states can take the vote away from African American men? The national position really strengthens the federal government as the one who has to protect its citizens in the right to the ballot. In fact, when they start their civil disobedience campaign, which the National does, they refuse to pay their taxes. They, taxation without representation is tyranny. And they also vote, and it's illegal to vote. And so they push the envelope and they say, Gage writes, we are not the lawbreakers. The lawbreakers are the federal government, which is refusing to protect us in our sacred right to the ballot as citizens of a republic based on the consent of the government. It's a brilliant legal argument, but it doesn't win. Supreme Court, 1875, a national women's suffrage association officer sues the registrar that refuses to let her register to vote, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. 9 white men say, if there is one case which can be said to be settled now and forever, it is this one. Women do not have the right to vote guaranteed in the United States of America. So they switch tactics, but they're still focusing on a federal amendment, but they're dealing in the national organization with all kinds of other issues. The American, not so much. So Susan B. Anthony has a vision. We have to get the vote. The vote is the most important thing. Gage and Stanton disagree with her when they're doing the history of women's suffrage, the first 3 volumes together. Stanton and Gage write, vote is not an end in itself. It's simply a tool by which to lift the fourfold oppression that women suffer at the hands of the church, the family, the capitalist, and the state. But for Anthony, it was an end in itself. And in 1889, she engineers a merger between the National and the American, which is really an American takeover. Becomes a states' rights organization, becomes as conservative and more so than the American is. And it also brings in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is 10 times stronger than the suffrage movement. But the women not only want to outlaw tobacco and liquor in the United States, they want to destroy the wall of separation of church and state. They want to create a Christian nation. Gage says that's the greatest danger of the hour. If we lose religious freedom in this country, it's not going to matter who votes. She drops out of the movement and she drops out of history because the movement gets more and more conservative and ends up appealing to the South. They say, in order to get the vote, we're going to have to get the southern states to ratify. And the only way we can do that is to play the race card. They adopt racism as policy. Here's how they do it. They segregate. They don't let African-American women come to their conventions. Anthony in 1895 asks Frederick Douglass not to attend because the convention's in the South, in Atlanta. They allow the state auxiliaries to work for voter suppression, for Jim Crow laws. They allow the state auxiliaries to segregate, and they allow them to work for the vote for white women only. The National American Woman Suffrage Association makes the argument, give women the vote because white women outnumber Negroes, men and women, and we also outnumber immigrants, men and women. So you give women the vote and you got a twofer. Not only will we support white supremacy, but it's also a way to maintain native-born supremacy as well. Anti-immigrant sentiment. Stanton's final speech, the last one of her life at a convention, is an argument for educated suffrage. That's a dog whistle for white, privileged voters only. African Americans, of course, when they were enslaved, weren't allowed to read and write. And immigrants, instead of saying, well, we need to put more, we need to teach them to read and write in English, and at the same time, we need to have our ballots in multiple languages. No, they didn't push that. They took a position, and that position has tremendous impact on where we are today. Because women of color did not get the vote in 1920. In practice, constitutional amendments said they were protected from the states, but the federal government never enforced that, and still does not enforce it well today. But African American women and men really didn't have practically the possibility of voting until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. For Asian women, it wasn't until citizenship. For Indian women, Native American women, it wasn't until 1924, and voter suppression tremendously in all those areas. So for me, in 2020, looking back, 50 years of looking at this moment, here is what I come to. It's a time for us to look at our history differently. History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We need to have all the voices at the table to tell the multiplicity of stories that are really what happened. And when we listen to the voices of women of color, what we hear is 1920 is not a day for us to celebrate. 1920, August 26th, didn't give us the vote. It gave us the possibility. African American women fought crazily to get the vote. And then once the 19th Amendment was passed, they didn't have it. The suffragists, the white suffragists, threw women of color under the bus. They won the battle, but they lost the war for freedom for us. And that's where we have to pick up today. It is incumbent on us, I believe, to acknowledge the racism of the movement, to ensure that we don't do it again. And we need to hold these women accountable as their peers did, and as we hold each other accountable today. I'm a recovering racist. I hold myself accountable. I sometimes give myself a pass if I really didn't understand, but I have to really make myself into somebody who will never do that again. If I do it a second time, it's an act of self-conscious, deliberate racism, and I hold myself accountable. That's how I hold my foremothers accountable. They knew what they were doing. They chose. How many lives of African Americans, men and women, would have been saved if they had joined Ida B. Wells' fight to end lynching? How much would we have benefited from the voices of African American women and Native women? You got somebody around you who has 1,000 years of experience of something, and you got 100 years, and you're not listening to them? My mentors at this moment in my life are women of color, and young people as well. But I think the the damage that was done by the suffragists, we need to acknowledge, along with the fact that they did push democracy a bit further. And now it is our responsibility to carry that thread of democracy into the future. Someday we can create democracy in the United States of America. It's up to us. Thank you.